Thank you for listening to Gooston's Bible Time. Today's sponsor is Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Today, we're going to be continuing in Apologetics, but also continuing in the little miniature group of Atheism and such as that. I guess particularly we're going to be looking at Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. So, yeah, very philosophical, heavy session tonight, so that'll be fun. So I'm going to hand it over to Josh, who's going to pray for us and get into all the meat and potatoes of it.
All right, here we go. Father, help us to understand those who hate you and who have set up every lofty argument against the knowledge of your Son, so that we might tear those very things down as you've commanded us to do in your word. Amen. Okay. So, if you haven't been here for the last 5 weeks, I think now, I'm not going to recap. I'm going to recap less and less each week because the recap will eventually become the amount of time I have. So, we've been talking about apologetics and teaching what a biblical apologetic would look like, a defense of the faith, a way to engage the unbelief of others and our own unbelief. And we've walked through the biblical foundations for apologetics, the mode and manner of our apologetics. And now we're stepping into the shoes of the unbeliever, which is one of our prongs of our approach to apologetics is to do an internal critique of unbelieving worldviews. Well, to do a proper internal critique, you need to understand what their worldview argues for and what it says and what it is presenting itself as. And like I've said in the past, I'm presenting these things to you all in their most coherent fashion that they come in, and in the strongest versions they come in. Most people you talk to have not read a lot of these authors we're going to talk about. If they have read them, they may not have a strong working knowledge of them and their contents. But, and this is the reason we're going to cover them, their ideas have been incredibly influential. Ideas have consequences, and they trickle down and into the hearts and minds of people. You can find the ideas that we're going to talk about today in our culture today, in Western culture specifically. And this week, we're going to look at the originators of these ideas. And in the weeks to follow, we're going to look at contemporary versions of those ideas, how they've evolved from the originals. But the original idea is still going to be there in seed form in some way. And so it's important to understand where these things come from, because sometimes you still find them in their pure form. Some people hold to to those beliefs, but the general common beliefs that we run into all stem from some of these. Last week we covered Darwin and Darwinism and evolutionary naturalism specifically as a worldview, and then showed that it collapses in on itself when carried out consistently. This week we're going to do a bit of a history lesson, and more so than anything else, we're as we go through this, you'll notice I won't use as much Bible as I normally do, and the reason for that is because we're looking at unbelievers' worldviews. so they don't have much Bible in their worldview. When we get to strong criticisms of them, we will bring Bible in. But for now, this is more informative because I want to lay the groundwork properly and do my due diligence and show you where these things come from and where they have taken us today. So that's the purpose of the session like tonight and some of the ones in the next few weeks. And tonight we're not going to do as much critique because next week we will look at cultural Marxism, which is the current kind of evolution of Marx's ideologies that is prevalent within our culture, prevalent all over the place. We'll look at that in detail and do a critique of it. The week after, we're going to look at the sexual revolution, which in large part Freud has a huge impact on getting that started. So we're looking at Freud this week, but we're going to look at his great-grandchildren, I guess you could say, at least ideologically. So we'll talk about things like transgenderism, homosexuality, and the way that sexuality has become essential to people's personhood. Week after, we'll look at Nietzsche and his progenitors, which have become the postmodernists and the nihilists and all of those things. That is actually kind of going out of fashion in some ways, as people are going with Marx and Freud more often than not. And like I said, most people haven't thought about these things very carefully. They haven't read the primary sources, just is what it is. And they also have not thought through their worldview very consistently. They will have a mishmash of beliefs based upon their education, their background, their context, what they read, what they watch on TV and or YouTube, or the people they follow on social media. That all of that is discipling them. And the word of caution to us is that all of that is discipling you. So take the time before you go and critique and examine other people's worldviews as we do this study to critique and examine your own and to flush out the things that are not biblical and replace them with the truth. You have to use your apologetics on yourself first and consistently over time before you think about going and drawing your sword and going into battle with other worldviews. So there's my recap and my forward cap, my forward projection. This is where we're going next few weeks. We're going to be in this apologetics stream for a while, probably half of this year. And that's because I want to do the due diligence. In fact, you'll have the equivalent, if I've presented my material properly and correctly, of a 1 or 2 intro classes to apologetics on a high school / college level. So at least in terms of the content, you obviously wouldn't have to do the work and write papers and things like that. But that's my goal. And that means that we're in the trenches with this for a good while longer. After that, I hope to transition into a study on counseling and sanctification and subjects related to discipleship. So that will be moving way forward, but we'll leave that off for now. Okay. So here we have a Bible verse to get us started. Psalm 14:1. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. This is an important Bible verse purely for this reason. Only the fool says in his heart, there is no God. We've looked at why that is in the past few weeks, so if you missed it, go back and listen. But when we're considering what the person in front of us, whether they're really standing in front of us or they're on our screens or wherever they are, when we're considering what they have to say to us, if they say in their heart, there is no God, the Bible says they're a fool. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't know things about the world. It doesn't mean they can't be right about stuff. But what it does mean is that you have to remember that whatever ideas they're presenting, whatever worldview that they are working from, is at bottom foolishness. So remember, consider that as we examine some of these things. If any of it sounds enticing to you, that is your sinful heart, and cut it out. Because some of these world people are like, yeah, this sounds great. I'd love it if everybody could just live this way. That would be great. And it's like, no, it wouldn't. One, it wouldn't be, because it militates against God's word. But two, that is your sinful heart talking, and so we cut that out real quick. All right. So tonight we're looking at Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. These guys, I've kind of dubbed them the atheist of APC. What does that stand for? Arbitrary prejudicial conjecture. It's a quote by one of my favorite apologists, Greg Bonson, who I've linked some of his content in the past. And what he means by that is that they're starting assumptions to their worldview. What is foundational to their worldview consists of an arbitrary, so it doesn't have any reasoning behind it. It's completely arbitrary. I just chose it because I like it. It's prejudicial, so it's prejudice. That they already have a predisposition toward that choice. And it's a conjecture. It has no basis in reality. It is conjectural. These guys are the atheists of the arbitrary prejudicial conjecture. Why? Unlike some of the evolutionary Darwinists, naturalists that you might find, they don't attempt to argue with you on the basis of science or reason for their atheism. Rather, their atheism is their starting place. They've assumed it already, and then they critique Christianity on the assumption that the Christians are the crazy ones living in an atheistic universe. So their critiques of Christianity are grounded in an assumption that atheism is already true. And that's why they're the atheists of the arbitrary prejudicial conjecture, because they've assumed at the outset that atheism is true, and then they've worked from there to critique Christianity. So if anyone ever says they became an atheist because they read Marx, Freud, or Nietzsche, well, that's a bit of a silly thing to say, because their critique, they are self-admitting, even in the case of Marx and Nietzsche, that their rejection of Christianity is purely out of their, in the case of Nietzsche, they're his passions, and in the case of Marx, because he doesn't like it very much. Just, I don't like it, therefore it's false. And we know that's not a good reason to not believe Christianity. So let's introduce you to our characters here. First up, we have Karl Marx. Contrary to maybe popular belief, he was not Russian. He was a German fellow who lived in Prussia, not Russia, but Prussia, and was exiled from there for his political ideologies, and lived in England and London for most of his life, and that's where he published most of his writings. While his ideologies were made famous by the revolutions in Russia, which led to the deaths of millions of people, that's not where he comes from. And so Marxism is born and bred in a democratic society. It's the only place where it can come to fruition, or at least can be spoken out loud. So, what about Marxism? Well, it assumes an atheistic society at the outset. Let me read from some of his work here. His most popular work is the Communist Manifesto, which some of you may have had to read already, or at least may be familiar with. So, he says in The Opium of the Masses, this is, you may have heard that quote before as well, where he says religion is the opiate of the masses. The basis of irreligious criticism is this: Man makes religion. Religion does not make man. So notice that is his starting assumption. That is the basis of his criticism of religion. And specifically Christianity. Let's be honest here. All of these guys have in their sights Christianity, though they will talk about religion in the abstract. Their target is Christianity. They lived in the West. They lived in where Christianity was at least the most populous affirmed belief. Even if some of the people were not very Christian about their Christianity, they at least affirmed it outwardly, and so this was the target of their criticism. He goes on, and this is where we'll pick up some of his worldview that he's trying to replace Christianity with. To abolish religion as the illusory happiness of the people is to demand their real happiness. The demand to give up illusions about the existing state of affairs is the demand to give up a state of affairs which needs illusions. The criticism of religion is therefore in embryo the criticism of the veil of tears, the halo of which is religion. The criticism of religion disillusions man to make him think and act and shape his reality, like a man who has been disillusioned and has come to reason, so that he will revolve round himself and therefore round his true sun. Religion is only the illusory sun, which revolves round man as long as he does not revolve round himself. So what does all of that mean? Well, Marx is most well known for his application of a fellow named Hegel, which we'll look at next week. Hegel's philosophy of history. He's most well known for his application of that to political theory. Namely, that the history of the world is defined by oppressors and the oppressed. And religion, for him, is a tool of the oppressor to keep the oppressed from realizing what they are, that they are, in fact, oppressed. And that's what he's talking about there, that religion is this illusion that prevents you from seeing that you should be revolving around yourself. You should be the center of the universe, not this God. And so we see that the root and foundation of his worldview is idolatry. Something the Bible repudiates very clearly, that the world isn't about you, according to the Bible. It's about God. And Marx sees that clearly enough to say, well, actually, it shouldn't be about God. It should be about you because God doesn't exist. Why? Because I said so. And that's his reasoning. And this is the first pillar for Marx that must fall for the oppressed to overthrow their oppressors. Which is why in Marxist countries, in communistic countries, you find a stifling of religion constantly. Constantly. You find that over and over again, because if religion makes a comeback, then they got a problem. Because their communism falls over. And the reason why it has to go down first is because for him, religion is what keeps people asleep to their situation as an oppressed people group. So he says, the criticism of heaven turns into the criticism of the earth, the criticism of religion into the criticism of law, and the criticism of theology into the criticism of politics. So there's this stating it very plainly that in order to start a political revolution, you need to first get rid of people's religious beliefs, because that's what keeps them happy in their oppression. That's why he calls it the opiate of the masses. It keeps them asleep to their true state in the world because it's illusory. Now, all those things are assumed by Marx at the outset, like we showed a moment ago, to be true at the beginning, that religion is illusory and that's why it needs to be taken down. Not, here are my reasons why religion isn't true, or why Christianity is false, or things like that nature. No, he just says, it's already illusory. Why? Well, Because it is. Isn't it obvious? And that's the extent of his argument. And that's what he does is at the end of this section, he has a critique of Christian morality. And in it, he shows a vast misunderstanding of Christian morality and also thinks that some things that are good are actually, he calls good things evil and evil things good. And so again, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Marx is taught with a straight face to people in philosophy classrooms and political and economic classrooms all around Western society, and yet his argumentation and reasoning is completely baseless and full of arbitrary prejudicial conjectures, and nobody would accept that kind of standard in any other field of study. But we accept it in philosophy because why not? So that's why we have to cover someone like him, is not because I think that he's a giant intellectually or a consistent, well thought out thinker that has a fully fleshed out worldview that he's thought through very, very carefully. No, it's because everyone else takes him seriously, and that's the reason we have to. And people have adopted his ideas and are trying to live them out in the world. And as we have seen historically, it doesn't go well when they do. It really does not go well. So that's Marx in a brief, compacted, as much as I can, nutshell. So for him, religion is a tool of the oppressor. Its origin, then, is social. So his critique of religion comes down to the fact that he believes that religion as a tool was therefore constructed by the rich and the powerful to keep the poor and the slave and the weak, to keep them under control so that they will not rise up and overthrow them. So, for Marx, the origins of religious belief are socially constructed. Now we move on to Freud. Sigmund Freud. Oh, I forgot to give you Marx's dates when he was alive, because that matters. We can think about this in a historical context. 1818 to 1883. So he dies before 1900. That's how far back we're looking here. Freud is 1856 to 1939, so he actually lives quite a bit longer than anyone else we're going to look at today. So Freud is kind of who you think of when you think about your armchair therapist. You see it, the stereotype in TV shows and movies and such, where there's a nodding, posh individual who sits there and listens to you while you sprawl yourself out on a chair and then probes your childhood memories for the source of your problems, things like that. Freud is the progenitor of that stereotype. And much of the psychobabble that you hear today that is taken seriously, and a lot of the phraseology around mental health, people use that all the time. If you watch anything on YouTube, or you'll hear people talking about my mental health. And the reason why that phrase is constituted so much now, constitute is wrong word. The reason why it is so popular right now is because it has a foundation in a evolutionary naturalistic worldview. What do I mean? Well, Freud swallowed wholesale Darwin's evolutionary theory first. That's his starting point. From there, he then interprets the world according to his psychoanalysis that he's performing. And while many of his theories are not held in high regard by professionals, quote unquote, they've had an impact on our culture and the way people think about uh, what goes on in their head to such a deep degree that people have no idea how Freudian they are, which Freud would have loved, I guess, because for him, much of this is all subconscious, and it comes out in our lives and our actions, but much of it is happening at a subconscious level. So the fact that he has gotten himself into the cultural subconscious, he would probably be pretty pleased about that, or maybe he would have been miffed about it. Who knows? Um, so why is mental health Freudian in nature? Well, when you adopt an evolutionary naturalistic worldview, people are at bottom matter in motion. They are animals. So they don't have a immaterial aspect to them at all that can be afflicted in any way. So instead of being deranged or crazy, you have a mental health problem. You have a health problem. Just like the problem with you that you feel bad all the time emotionally, it can't be the case that you're, I don't know, convicted of your sin. That can never possibly be the case for Freud, because sin isn't real. It's not really wrong. He's a relativist when it comes to morality. There's no real right or wrong. So it has to be something wrong with your brain, or something that you experienced that your body is still reacting to in the past. That has to be the source of your mental health problems, because your mental health is the same as your physical health. In fact, putting the descriptive word of mental next to it really doesn't mean anything if you don't believe in that the mental is separable from the physical. So keep that in mind when you're listening to things out in the culturally popular spaces, when they say things like mental health or mental illness, some of those things like that. They're often adopting an evolutionary naturalistic worldview grounded in Freudian psychoanalysis. That's what's happening behind the scenes. They might not be self-aware about it, but they've swallowed it wholesale and are spitting it back out into the air. But I digressed a little bit. Let's talk about what he actually said, what he believed about religion and Christianity specifically. What is his critique as an atheist, and go from there. So I got some quotes from him here. I won't read this whole section. I'll just summarize it. So he's in the section I'm reading from. It's from his book, The Future of an Illusion. Let me answer this real quick because it may not have been clear. Someone asks, are you suggesting mental health is physical health? No, I'm saying it's not. I'm saying that's what Freud would have concluded. And that's what people are really saying when they use that descriptive word, if they're atheists, if they are not Christians, if they believe that there is no immaterial aspect to the human person that could be afflicted in the same way your physical aspect could be, then it's all physical. That's what they're saying. I'm not saying that. I'm against that because I think the Bible teaches that human beings are psychosomatic unions of materiality and immateriality that can impact each other in real ways. And so that's a significant piece of reality that much of science has departed from as a result of their atheism. All right. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify since it may have been unclear to others as well. Okay, so Freud, in his work here, the future of an illusion. Guess what the illusion is? It's religion. Surprise. He asks the question: how does he, mankind, defend himself against the superior powers of nature, of fate, which threaten him as they threaten all the rest? And he goes on: civilization relieves him of this task. It performs it in the same way for all alike, and it is noteworthy that in this almost all civilizations act alike. Civilization does not call a halt to the task of defending man against nature, it merely pursues it by other means. The task is a manifold one. Man's self-regard, seriously menaced, calls for consolation. Life and the universe must be robbed of their terrors. Moreover, his curiosity, moved, it is true, by the strongest practical interest, demands an answer. So when faced with, so this is him psychoanalyzing things, when faced with the terror of the universe, that you could at any time be swept away by any sort of natural disaster, and you know it, and you live with that every day, or an animal bigger than you could come along and eat you, or someone could break into your house and kill you. Like, faced with all of the different ways you could die every day, you have to cope with it. That's what he's arguing for, that religion is a coping mechanism to cope with the fact that we are dust. He wouldn't use that phrase, but the fact that we are fragile. And so to deal with that, he then goes through and explains how different religions kind of birth themselves out of trying to control that fear. Because for Freud, most of the things that we do in our lives have their basis in some kind of fear or desire, one or the other. And that is going to come out in things that he says later. For example, he says the gods retain their threefold task. They must exorcise the terrors of nature, and that's not exercise, that's like exorcism. They must exercise the terrors of nature. They must reconcile men to the cruelty of fate, particularly as it is shown in death, and they must compensate them for the sufferings and privations which a civilized life in common has imposed on them. So he's saying, again, when faced with all of the suffering of life, people create gods to try to control them. That's his explanation for religious belief. Now, is it the case that some people believe in a religious worldview in order to deal with the suffering of their life? Absolutely. Does that in any way, shape, or form falsify the claims of Christianity, for example? No, it does not. The motivations that someone has for believing a worldview in no way, shape, or form falsifies the truth claims of that worldview. Your motivations could be like the ones that Freud describes for being a Christian, and they would be wrong-headed motivations. And in fact, I would encourage you to repent and believe the gospel, because you didn't believe the gospel, you believed something else. And that doesn't mean that Christianity is false just because someone is believing it out of Freudian-esque motivations. Now, he also is going, he sees a lot of the world, as we'll see down here, in terms of filial and sexual relationships. So Freud is the progenitor of all of the weird sex stuff. And that's why we're going to talk about his great-grandchildren, basically, are those in the transgender movement, the homosexuality movement, all of the sexual revolution. Freud is their grandpa. He laid the groundwork for them to take off. So he sees a lot of this grounded in those kinds of things. So here's another quote. He says, "Thus a store of ideas is created." This is religious ideas. "Born from man's need to make his helplessness tolerable, and built up from the material of memories of the helplessness of his own childhood and the childhood of the human race." So he has, most of your things that you do in life are compensating for your daddy issues. And that's why you have strong masculine figures being at the top of all of these pantheons of gods, et cetera, et cetera. And then he would say that the fullest expression of that is the Father in Christianity. And yet again, there we have it. Now, he could, theoretically, I don't think he is, he could be right about all of it, and it would not falsify for a moment the truth claims of Christianity. I want to restate that as many times as I can. Just because someone might believe something for the wrong reasons doesn't mean the thing they believe is not true. It is not an argument against Christianity, though you will hear it, that you only are a Christian because you were born to Christian parents, or born in the United States where Christianity is popular, or born at, where you were born. It might be true that you began to believe Christianity because of the strong influence your parents had upon you. That doesn't mean for a moment that Christianity is false. It doesn't. It has no bearing on the question. But that is often an argument that you will hear in places like r/atheism, and from more, I don't want to say reputable sources, but more popular sources like Richard Dawkins, for example, who we will talk about as the grandchild of Nietzsche and Darwin. That you can have a wrong motive for believing something, and that has no bearing on the truth or falsity of the thing you believe. You can believe true things for bad reasons, you can believe untrue things for bad reasons, or you can believe true things for the right reasons. Notice I did not say you can believe untrue things for the right reasons, because believing a lie is wrong all the time, because we ought to believe the truth and not a lie. So there you go. All right. So I have another quote from Freud to wrap him up. Yeah, everything that happens in this world, so he's making a sweeping worldview claim. You have to look out for claims like this. You're trying to figure out someone's worldview, look for universal claims. Everything that happens in this world, he says, is an expression of the intentions of an intelligence superior to us, which in the end, though its ways and byways are difficult to follow, orders everything for the best, that is, to make it enjoyable for us. Oh yeah, sorry. I started this quote without remembering why I put to read it. It is true to look out for universal claims when talking to people about their worldview, but he's actually trying to describe here his conception of what religious people believe. And so I wanted to point out that most of these guys demonstrate, whenever they try to describe Christianity, that they do not have a handle on what it is at all. They misrepresent it constantly. They have no idea what they're talking about. They clearly weren't paying attention in their catechetical classes growing up in whatever, Nietzsche was raised Lutheran. I'm not sure about Marx and Freud, but I mean, oh yeah. Freud was Jewish. There we go. My wife knows a lot more about Freud than I do because she's studied a lot more psychology than I have. My degree's in philosophy. But there you go. So his quote here is saying that religious people believe that everything that happens in the world is the expression and intention of intelligence superior to us, which I would agree with as Christian. But here we go. Which in the end, though its ways and byways are difficult to follow, orders everything for the best, which I would agree with. But then he says, that is to make it enjoyable for us. And that is where he finds so much of a problem. Because he's like, no, life is not enjoyable. And I'm like, well, that's not the point. And that's an assumption he's making about Christianity, is that that Christians believe that providence, that God's ordering of the world, is to make the world as enjoyable for us as possible, and enjoyable according to Freud's categories of enjoyment. Now, I'm on board with someone like John Piper, who might say that God's utmost glorification of himself is our highest joy, or ought to be, as Christians. But that's not the point Freud's making, so I won't try to finagle him out of the situation that he's gotten himself into, which is to make a really dumb claim about what Christians believe when they don't believe that. So he goes on to, I won't read the rest of that because we're running out of time. He goes on to describe the rest of things in a ridiculous fashion. And again, he has a misunderstanding of what Christians believe. So for Freud, the origins of religion are primarily psychological. That religion is a defense mechanism that we create in our minds to defend ourselves against the cruelties of life, our desires for a good and strong father, and the helplessness of our childhoods. To recapture that, I guess, I'm not sure exactly what he's on about with that last point, but that is a basic summary of his belief there. And he lays the groundwork as a result for the psychoanalysis that results in people finding their identity in something else. So if you should get rid of religion, so he eventually does make the argument that you shouldn't be religious because it is a form of wish fulfillment. You're trying to, you have a desire that the world would be kind to you, and that's not good for you to mask that with religious beliefs that are not true. So instead, you need to just face reality as it is and find other ways to deal with it. And what ends up resulting from that is people then follow whatever desires that they have, being unfettered by the moral constraints of religion. They now just follow their desires every which way they would like to. And Freud is kind of the progenitor of the kind of psychoanalysis that leads someone to say, oh, well, so one, you shouldn't believe in God because that's bad for your mental health. And two, you need to embrace whoever you are. Do self-introspection, find out who you are inside, and then embrace it wholeheartedly and follow your passions wherever they lead. That's what ends up happening as a result of his deconstruction of religious beliefs. And we see the results today. Now, on to Nietzsche. You may hear it pronounced Nietzsche by some people. I think that sounds weird, so and my professors in college said Nietzsche, so I just say Nietzsche because, yeah, I don't know if that's correct, but that's what I'm going to call him. Or we can call him Fred. His first name's Friedrich, so we can just call him Fred. But for the sake of consistency, I'll call him Nietzsche. Born 1844, dies in 1900, so he dies at the turn of the century. For him, religion is a product, ironically, the opposite of Marx. It is the product of a slave morality. It is used by the weak, the slave, to attempt to overthrow the powerful. So for Marx, it's a tool of the powerful to keep the slave oppressed. For Nietzsche, it's a tool of the slave to express his resentment and revenge upon the powerful. That he can't touch, he has no power to actually touch the powerful. He can't revolt. He has no way to do it. So he rebels against the powerful by inventing a religion that will bring justice upon the powerful one day. So for Nietzsche, it is a complete construct like Marx and Freud, but its purpose is to allow the weak and the oppressed and the slave to get revenge and show their resentment for their masters through their religious beliefs, because they can't actually pick up a sword and go and take them down because they're not powerful. So he sees the ultimate evolution of man from weakness to strength as beginning with the shedding of religious belief. To be powerful, you need to be an atheist, in Nietzsche's view. So as ahistorical as that perspective is, where most of the powerful people in history were religious in some way, Nietzsche's views are popular. He's a popular philosopher, even though he was a wandering pilgrim for most of his life, seeking physical healing for his illnesses. After he was a professor for a little while in philology, study of language. And then when his health and some other things got in the way, he just wandered around writing and trying to find a cure for what ailed him, and died of complications from syphilis in 1900. So he lived according to his worldview. He just wandered wherever his passions took him. And ironically, he was among the weak and the sick and the powerless. Though his ideology and the way he talks, you would think that he was a bit of a macho Chad, but he wasn't. And he died because of him living out his ideology consistently. At least that's the speculation, since he died from syphilis. So let me read to you some of Nietzsche, and then I'll talk more about how his critique of religion and then his worldview, his replacement for it. This is from his work, Religion as Resentment. Like I said, very on the nose. Here's his description of the Jews specifically. And it's no surprise, though he himself, at least it's reported in the sources that I've looked at, was not an anti-Semite. He was not, didn't hate Jewish people. He even broke off a relationship with a good friend of his because of his friend's anti-Semitism. He finds the Jewish worldview to be abhorrent, the same way he finds the Christian one to be abhorrent, because there are similar moral values between us at some level. And so he says, thus only it befitted a priestly people, the people of the most powerfully suppressed priestly vindictiveness. It was the Jews who, with most frightfully consistent logic, dared to subvert the aristocratic equation of values. Good equals noble equals powerful equals beautiful equals happy equals beloved of God. So he thinks that's a good equation. That the good is the noble and the powerful and the beautiful and the happy. And that should be how the religious equation should have turned out. That you're loved by God if you're good, noble, powerful, beautiful, and happy. He goes on. And who, with the teeth of the profoundest hatred, the hatred of impotency, or lack of power, clung to their own valuation. This is his understanding of the Jewish evaluation of who is good and who is bad. The wretched alone are the good. The poor, the impotent, the lowly alone are the good. Only the sufferers, the needy, the sick, the ugly are pious. Only they are godly, them alone blessedness awaits. But ye the proud and potent, ye are for aye and evermore the wicked, the cruel, the lustful, the insatiable, the godless. Ye will also be to all eternity the unblessed, the cursed, and the damned. And so he would apply that to Christian beliefs as well. So there you have that. And he goes on, in regard to the enormous initiative fatal beyond measure which the Jews gave by this most fundamental declaration of war, I refer to the proposition which elsewhere presented itself to me in another of his books, namely that with the Jews the slave revolt in morality begins, that revolt which has a history of 2,000 years behind it and which today is only removed from our vision because it has been victorious. So he sees the conquest of Western society by Christianity to be the victory of the slave revolt of morality. It's this guy was on something. I mean, to look at history in such an ahistorical fashion and then interpret it according to such a wild-eyed presupposition. One, fueled the fire of the Nazis later on, by the way. Whether Nietzsche himself thought like them or not, which, historical reports say he doesn't. If you read his writings, you might think that he does. They used a lot of his writings. They also used the writings of Martin Luther, so I can't, I'm obviously not going to lump Martin Luther into the same boat as Nietzsche, but they used a lot of this ideology to fuel their hatred of the Jews. So there's a bit of Nietzsche. And I will not read the other quotes I had. I had quite a few, but that should give you an idea of the man we're dealing with. He's a bit of a ranter in his writings. It's difficult to read. It's even worse reading it in German. So good luck if you want to do that. Which I've done a little bit of. Not a lot. Just enough to know how bad it is. So Nietzsche is a nihilist. Nihilist is from the word nihil or nihil, however you want to say it. I'm not going to try. Latin words to get over the fact that no one knows how to pronounce them anyway. And it's nothingism. So for Nietzsche, there's no morality, no objective truth, no God, even everything that we think we know, we don't know. That knowledge is a function, a practical tool that we created in order to get along with each other better. Same thing for language. None of these things have any basis in reality. They are all illusions that we have crafted. There really is just nothing objective out there when it comes to objective truth claims. And this is why he is the granddad of the postmodernists and the relativists. Now, his solution to the nothingism, the nihilism, is that you should therefore follow your passions. Become the Übermensch, the Overman, the Superman, as he called it, and take whatever power you can, live according to your desires, do what you want, because nothing matters. So do whatever you like to. Now, ironically, he still sets up a standard of goodness and badness. He just will claim to his dying breath that those things have no objective nature to them. But that's essentially Nietzsche in the briefest capacity I can give to him. So for him, religion's origin is an arbitrary construction designed. Sorry, I can't read my own handwriting on my notes. An arbitrary construction derived by the passions, because it's created by the weak and the oppressed in order to seek out their passion of resentment toward the strong, the powerful. So the opposite of Marx, and a radically different conclusion than Marx, because he doesn't care about overthrowing the powerful. He wants to become the powerful. Take power by whatever means you please and wield it however you'd like, because it doesn't matter in the end. So there you have it. A bit depressing, I know, but it will matter both in your own fighting these sins in your own heart. These sins are not unique to Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. They're clearly evident in our culture, and they're clearly evident in the history of humanity. And if you examine yourself, you'll find them in your own heart. You'll find the whining of Marx that the world's just out to get him, and you're oppressed by the powerful, the ridiculous psychoanalysis of Freud that I am what I feel most deeply inside, and that my identity is wrapped up in my sexuality, or the insanity of Nietzsche. That, in the end, it doesn't really matter. You can try so hard and get so far. But there it is. All right. So with that reference, showing my boomerness even more. I will sign off. Let me pray, and I can stick around for a little bit for questions, but Justin may have to go. Says I went long. I recognize that, but there was a lot to cover, so I'll try to keep things shorter next week if I can do so, which I certainly can. All right. Father, thank you for giving us truth and hope in a world of fools, that we who once said in our hearts there is no God, either with our mouth openly or with our actions, we could have professed to know you but lived in rebellion, and therefore we said in our hearts that you were not there. Thank you for saving us from that insanity. Thank you for saving us from our sin, the sin of atheism and the sin of foolishness and all of the sins that flow out of that. Help us to be compassionate toward those who are still stuck in such a state, to show love to them, to share the truth with them, and to kill the atheism in our own hearts, first and foremost. Amen.
Amen. There's some good stuff, Josh. Yeah, we still do have a bit of time for questions. I don't have anything too pressing to leave for, so we can have some time allotted for that still. If y'all want to put your questions in the text chat or use your voice, you can do either way. Doesn't matter. If you try to use your voice, just be mindful of other people trying to talk. But yeah, if you have any questions, now is the time to do it.
Well, first, I have to address this. Yes, I am a boomer. I do know how to use a computer. I just take handwritten notes because it's easier for me that way. Okay? I wear my boomer badge proudly, but I do know how to use a computer, mostly. I mean, my job works with one, but, it is what it is. I have noise suppression on, so you didn't hear my wife making fun of me even more. Or no, she was making fun of all of you, actually. Oh, yeah. She said you Zoomers need to learn how to write. So there
Harsh.
it is. All right, question time. Just joking. All memes. We have great love for the Zoomers. They make us feel younger or older, depending on the day.
I have a question.
Hit me.
So when you were talking about mental health earlier, I didn't understand when you said like physical versus like mental health isn't being physical, or but like you were saying it was a result of like conviction. But like what about like people who like are like Christians, and yet like obviously people get convicted and stuff, but I'm saying like people who are like clinically diagnosed with depression because of like their brain chemistry and stuff like that.
Great, good question. So first, let me clarify that not all issues related to one's mental state necessarily come from conviction of sin. I just said that. I stated that as a alternative possibility compared to the exclusively I don't want to say naturally, but the exclusively physicalist perspective of much of contemporary psychology and sociology that would find the problem rooted in your biology and only in your biology. That has to be where the problem is, because they're atheists, because it can't possibly be something like sin. They've already excluded that at the outset. That's what I meant when I said that. And that's why I said that there really is no distinction for the atheist between mental and physical health. It's all just health, because it's all physical in terms of it finds its origin in something wrong with your body. Because your mental state is generated purely by your brain and nothing else. Does that make more sense? If not, let me clarify before I continue to the second part of your question.
Yeah, that made a lot more sense. Like, it's not all just brain chemistry and stuff like that.
Right. If you're a Christian, you believe that humans are much more complicated than that. And that is why the diagnoses of psychiatrists and psychologists, when they diagnose someone with a mental illness, they're utilizing the standards of, at least in America, certainly they are, of a little dandy little book called, let me make sure I'm getting this right from my wife because she knows more. Is it the DSM, right? DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, the 5th edition. And if you go and read some of their descriptions of what qualifies as things like depression and other forms of what's described as mental illness, you realize very quickly that they have no idea what they're doing. That they're calling these diagnoses out based upon correlations, and they actually don't know and can't identify by just talking with you about the causation. Now, that is not to say that depressive states cannot be caused by things wrong with your body. A very good mentor figure in my life over the last year had a thyroid problem, and it caused him to be very fatigued, which then affected his emotions quite a bit, and got that fixed. And he's been fine. He's been chilling ever since. So I'm not saying that it's not possible. In fact, I am saying the opposite of what they are saying, and that is that the body and the mind, the immaterial and the material that constitute the human nature, impact one another deeply. That for some people, their depression is solvable, so to speak, by just taking a walk every day. And that's like, oh wow, I feel so much better because I was just wallowing in my own filth inside. Of course I was, in a funk. And for other people, no matter what they do, they can't seem to shake it. And that might have a physical root to it. Or it might be a complication of multiple things, where there's a physical thing happening and there's a spiritual thing happening. Or it could also be a purely spiritual thing happening. And the DSM-5 does not consider any of those other kinds of possibilities as valid, except for there's a physical thing happening. So what that means is, if someone diagnoses you with a mental illness, they're doing it based on correlations, not causations. Not the way a doctor would be like, oh, hey, I can take an x-ray, I can look at your stomach, and I can see there's a hole in it, and that's what's giving you stomach pain. Because I can tell, like, that is that is a direct causal link. They can't take a scan of your brain all the time and say, yep, there it is. That's the thing that's causing you to be depressed. That's what makes you feel like your life is terrible and that you want to die every day. They can't do that all the time. They just can't. And that means they have to base it on corollaries that they identify, and they might get the cause wrong as a result, and then they either misdiagnose or they prescribe you a solution which hurts you worse and doesn't help you. So there's a lot more I could say about that topic. That's my briefest answer. But psychological studies, sociological studies are corollary. The soft sciences, like psychology and sociology, are not causal studies. They're always corollary studies. And one of the first fallacies you learn about in philosophy, ironically, is a correlation causation fallacy, that a correlation does not equal a causation. You cannot establish a chain of causation from one event to the next by establishing a correlation. Let me give you an example. So every day, I see the same school bus ride through my neighborhood. Well, if at the same time that my school bus rides through my neighborhood every day, I hear a knocking in my attic. And then I conclude as a result that the knocking is caused by the school bus coming through my neighborhood. Or I conclude as a result that the school bus only comes through my neighborhood when the knocking happens. That's a fallacy of logic. But that's exactly how they diagnose many of these mental illnesses. They see something and then they see another thing happening at the same time and they go, they must be causally related, so we need to treat or get rid of this thing because we are assuming that it's causing this other thing. All right, so there you go. That's a long answer, and there's more that can be said. And I do intend to cover this subject in more depth in the future. But there you go.
Any other questions? No? Okay, well then we can officially be done